Hi, Sudeep. Welcome. Thank you for coming to Madhuribhumi Festival, and many congratulations for winning the Tagore Prize this year. It makes the poet community really proud. You've been writing. You've been for years. One of the leading poets from the country. So um, I thought we'll start the session with you reading from this. This is the one that won the Tagore Prize. So we start. Why didn't we start? You know, to set the tone, so to speak.
Good afternoon. It's lovely and hot, and Sabine's, even though he's smiling, he's very frazzled because he's also the director. But just cut him some rope and me. We both actually, funnily enough, wanted to also hear Amitav Ghosh, who's somewhere else, because we're writing about the same thing. And I say this because this particular poem, which I'm starting with, is dedicated to Amitav Ghosh. This is a book called Anthropocene. It's to do with climate change, pandemic, and consolation. And I say consolation because 50% of the book is about light, about positivity. Because without that, you can't wake up every day. If we all think in terms of gloom and doom, it's very, very difficult to wake up and move forward. And that is across anything. We were listening to the session before about body shaming and so on. You have to be positive with your inner spirit, ultimately. So this is a poem called Disembodied. It's set in my home city of Delhi, but it could be anywhere, any big city where it's polluted and the problems are, similar to very big cities. Disembodied. My body carved from abandoned bricks of a ruined temple, from minaret shards of an old mosque, from slate remnants of a medieval church apse, from soil tilled by my ancestors. My bones don't fit together correctly as they should. The searing ultraviolet light from Aurora Borealis patches and etch corrects my orientation. Magnetic pulses prove potent. My flesh sculpted from the fruits of the tropics, blood from coconut water, skin colored by brown bark of Indian teak, my lungs fueled by Delhi's insidious toxic air, echo asthmatic sounds, a new vinyl dub remix. Our universe where radiation germinates from human follies, where contamination persists from mistrust, where pleasures of sex are merely a sport, where everything is ambition, everything is desire, everything is nothing, nothing and everything. White light everywhere, but no one can recognize its hue. No one knows that there is color in it, all possible colors. Body worshipped not for its blessing, but its contour. Artificial shape shaped by Nautilus. Skin moistened by L'Oreal and not by season's first rains. Skeleton strength not shaped by earthquakes or slow molded by fearless forest fires. Ice caps are rapidly melting, too fast to arrest glacial slide. In the near future, there will be no water left, or too much water that is undrinkable, excess water that will drown us all. Disembodied floats, afloat like Noah's Ark. No GPS, no pole star navigation, no fossil fuel to burn away. Just maps with empty grids and names of places that might exist. Already, there's too much traffic on the road. Unpeopled hollow metal shells without brakes swerve about, directionless, looking for an elusive compass.
Wonderful, Sudhir. Uh, Before we actually delve into Anthropocene, let me ask a general question. Be a cliched one, but then who is a poet?
Very few people are poets. You can see the number of people who show up for poetry. So clearly, it's not the sort of thing you should be doing if you're interested in lots of people following you. So poetry comes from within. It's not about the masses. It can be about the masses if a lot of people read. What do I say? It's a who's a poet? I think a poet is a good human being, ultimately. You have to be a clean souled person to be a good poet, I feel. Being just clever and erudite and intelligent is one thing. You can craft probably a good object made in words and textually interesting. But if that text or that piece of sculpture you make with words doesn't have a human resonance which is going to change another person, what's the point really? Poets are also people who sort of wake up on the wrong side of the bed. Clearly, I have a third antenna, like a little invisible elephant's trunk that picks up things that most other people do not, pick up. We are interested in things that, again, most people are not interested in. But having said all that, poetry is all around us. Poetry is all within us. This is what happens when there's a poetry session. Even the electronics goes against the grain of frequencies and electronics. But poetry is all around us. Think of it this way. All the important things in our life, important moments in our life, we resort to poetry. Birth, death, falling in love, falling out of love, being jilted, all the naming ceremonies, all the rituals in India is what? It's poetry, it's sung poetry, it's verses from texts.
These are the poetic moments.
Yes, and the poetry is the only session where you'll be continuously interrupted. Or why? Because we have stanza breaks, we have line breaks. So this is just treated as a line break. But really, poetry is all around us. And even if you think of, say, badly sung jingle in an advertisement, or even classical music and dance, all the dance you see on stage is basically dance to metrics of poetry, which is basically sung aloud. My next book, in fact, is called The Whispering Anklet, Payal. It's my 40 years of obsession with classical Indian music and dance, and it's all about dance. So I've spent a lot of time studying Bharatanatyam, Kalaripattu, Mohiniyattam. It's my real big passion. So any form of dance is essentially possible if it's danced to a particular kind of beat. And I will explain that and read a poem later to talk about this, how poetry is so integral to any art form, really. But of course, I'm biased. Poetry is the only thing that matters at the end of the day.
That's what a poet says. But this book is particularly important because we live in a time when the topic, the Anthropocene or the climate crisis, let's say, is there in your face. We can't. That's a reality. So there are a couple of things I want to ask you. One, how did you come up with this idea of coming up with a collection, naming it Anthropocene, because it's about pandemic, it's about the climate change, but as you said, it's also about the hope. it's not a gloom book, but it's also a book of hope and light. And so, how did you come up with doing a book? I mean, you just said that you're going to do a book based on dance. Okay, so Anthropocene is the call of the time that we live in, or I mean.
Yeah, so I was actually working on my book of dance, which I just mentioned, and the lockdown happened. So we were for 2 years. I live in Delhi, and Delhi was particularly severe, for stepping out of. We were given like an hour or so during the day to do our vegetable and milk shopping and everything. But other than that, we had to be shut out in our premises. And it was 2,000 rupees fine for
If you step
violating
out,
it. Yeah, and it was in a way I agree with it because that's how they got people under control. So it was a good thing that happened. How can you, as a writer, as a conscious human being, as an artist, not respond to what's happening around you? So in an odd kind of way, and it sounds ironic that the pandemic, this book was a gift to me of the pandemic. It sounds ironic because the pandemic was so negative, so
Yeah,
horrific.
that's right, yeah.
But this book really arose out of what I was facing all around me. I lost 12 people during COVID. I've heard of the horrors of partition in India, the carnage across the border and the killings and so on. But I am very, very privileged to be born in independent India, where I've never seen this kind of horror. I've only read it in films, books, and seen it in films and stories my grandparents have told me, but I've never seen this kind of horror. But during the second wave, the bodies were being burnt on the sidewalks in Delhi. Parking lots were changed to accommodate bodies because we ran out of crematorium space. So I would walk, and it was just, you cannot escape that kind of thing. So of course you sort of respond to it. And fortunately I have a terrace on my roof, and that was the little 5 by 5 feet of paradise for me. And the wonderful thing was, during the lockdown, within about 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, the skies became bluer, the birds came back, the air was cleaner. Nature does not take that much time to heal. The problem is with us. Yeah. Anthropocene is what? It's the age that the man or a woman has created. And we have not created something, we are destroying something. It's really ironic. A lot of my children's friends, when I talk to them, they say something very, very alarming to me. They said they don't want to have children because where are we going to put our children into this world? And it's a shocking thing to hear, that they don't want anybody to inhabit the world. We are probably lucky we'll be dead by the time the world self-destructs itself. It is self-destructing. In about 15 years' time, all the coastal cities around the world will be underwater. That's because the ice caps are melting. And the alarming rate of the water rising is astonishing. I live in a city which is totally polluted. I talk about it in this poem which I read.
You also mentioned in one of the interviews about the Kiribati Islands.
Yes.
You remember? I mean, he said it's so touched your heart then when the president said that we'll be one of the first islands to be submerged, right?
So I was just skipping news channels, and this was 20 years ago. This is not even a recent phenomena. And I came across this very, very elegant man, older gentleman, being interviewed by a journalist, and I think she was asking him about the current educational policies about this country, the island nation of Kiribati in the South Pacific. So he just smiled at her and said, I'm happy to answer this question, but I have a really pressing problem. My country is only 6.5 feet above the Pacific Ocean. It's a country of archipelago of 33 atolls, literally just 6.5 feet above the water. He says, my country is the first country that's going to go down. What are you going to do? Are you going to take all my country people and house them somewhere? Health policy? What are we talking about? They'll be the first climate refugees in the world. And that was 15-20 years ago. That country is gone. That country is gone. How many people have taken them? The privileged people have, of course, gone to other places. The rest, many of them drowned because they just took their kayak and started going that way, just like what was happening across the Mediterranean, during the Syrian war and so on. So where are we even talking about? What are we even talking about? We know all these things happen, but none of us want to change because we are utterly selfish as human beings, and we are only interested in ourselves. The whole people are worshipping this monolithic, erect figure called the letter I, as opposed to a lovely two-letter word called us. What are two eyes going to do if they're not interacting? There'll be two lonely souls, which is what has happened. We've forgotten about what us is, what we is, as what community is. So we have to think of climate change first within ourselves, and sociologically and anthropologically and also psychologically within us. We are us on stage. You're not to me, you're a colleague, you're a friend. I may have written the book, but you're reading the book. So you're equally important. Without you, the book doesn't exist. Without me, the book doesn't exist. Without you all, the book doesn't exist. So if you think holistically, then it's easier. I suppose, poets are also easier with smaller crowds because all of them are listening. I can see everyone here listening. In bigger crowds, people are on the phone texting, taking selfies. They're there for the wrong reason because it's a celeb speaking, for instance. Often they have not read the book because, who cares about the book? It's only the Facebook media post that matters. Anyway, I'm diverging because I can hear one of my gurus speaking at the back there. But yeah, we really need to look inwards and tell ourselves that, despite all the education, what are we doing with ourselves?
Yeah, even in literature, this climate fiction or climate literature is fast emerging. And how urgent do you think we need literature to focus on this climate change or climate crisis, let's say that?
See, it's a question which comes from lack of reading, this particular question. The reason is climate fiction and poetry and climate art existed since time immemorial.
It's true, but
it's only now being made sexy by using the word climate, eco-criticism, ecological literature and all that, purely because that's the trend of the time. Even Wordsworth or Coleridge or Vyasa or Ramanujan, they wrote about climate, but it was called nature poetry then.
Yeah, that's what I'm about to say. They said they saw the beauty in nature.
No, we also
you
see
are sounding something. There is some danger.
No. They also talked about destruction and so on. If you look at the big epics, they're talking about war, they're talking about floods, they're talking about, even Noah. Anyway, any of those literatures are talking about the same things as we are talking about. Only the points of references have changed now. So it existed all the time. Climate fiction is way behind climate poetry, for instance.
Okay.
Yeah, like Amitav Ghosh was speaking in the other room. He wrote somewhere, I think, saying that, there's not enough written by writers about ecology or climate. Only some novelists are doing it. And I put a repartee on, this is a thing on Twitter or something, saying that actually poets have been doing it for a long time. Even in the contemporary world, you can see a lot of poets doing it. This book, of course, is the first book from India which is entirely on this subject. But in a scattered way, people have been writing about it. How can you escape what's around you? Like right now, I don't want to sweat, but I am. I would like a fan directed at me, and the close-up of that camera is going to catch all the terrible beads, and my son is going to say, "Baba, you were looking horrible." Do I have a choice? No. So it's all around us. The reason I got my son involved is because I'm going to read this little poem, which is the first poem in the book. It's called That Is, I.E. I normally don't share my poetry with my son, but occasionally I just sort of send it just to see what happens. And of course I sent this poem and he said, "Baba, not one more poem," that's like I have to treat him for a good dinner if he had to read my poem. Anyway, he got back to me saying, I read the poem, it's rather beautiful, which took me by surprise because first of all, your child being positive about your parenthood. And the second thing is, of course, he got me down to Mother Earth saying, I have no idea what you're talking about. But to me, that was enough because at least the aesthetic nerve in a young person got tingled. Comprehension can happen later. So it's dedicated to my son Arya, spelled Aria. Arya is in Arjo, Putro. The wonderful thing that happened with this book was the book came out during the pandemic, so there was no live interaction like this. So we did a lot of these Zoom, StreamYard things with, and it was a strange thing. You wear a clean shirt, and I'm still wearing my dirty shorts underneath the table. Wonderful in many ways. And you're just interacting with these strange virtual little mosaic rectangles of faces. So I would see this lady, often on the screen at various sessions I did on Zoom. And then she tracked my email down saying that I'm a poet and a songwriter and a musician. She lives in America. And she says, I bought this book. I really like the book. And I want to take 6 poems from the book and make them into songs. So what do you say, no or yes? I said, of course, you're welcome to. The only thing I told her is don't break up the poems to make it, just. So since then, she's released an album called That Is. This is the title of the album. It's available on Spotify and on downloads. Of course, the poem and the sung version is very, very different from what you'll hear right now. That is. That is because you hear the sound of a lone rustling leaf. You hear the sea. That is because I consider the sea silent. You hear its silence in my studio. That is, and because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves. I'll read this poem called Hope Light Leads. It's a multi-genre book. We'll talk about it soon.
In a bit, yeah.
But there's a poem opposite this. There's a photograph opposite this poem. Side B of my life is as a photographer. And my photography tends to be fairly abstract. So this photograph was taken, typical situation at night. You wake up in the middle of the night, you go to the loo, and then when you come out of the loo, I forgot to turn off the light and shut the door properly. So when I sat in the bed, this is during the winter, so you have to traverse the cold floors. So once you're back under the duvet, you don't see it in this part of India because you don't have winter. Just the decision to go back up and turn off the light is a big monumental task. Do I or do I not get out of the quilt? Anyway, so the light was just escaping from the edges of the door, and it to me looked like an half-baked crucifix. So that's where the poem starts from. And it was also around the time politically when the Black Lives Matter movement was happening. It's still happening. George Floyd had just been killed. So I suspect all those things were rumbling through my head. It's called Hope Light Leaks. And it has an epigraph from Martin Luther King Jr. And I quote, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that." Late at night, light leaks, spilling beyond the door's rectangle edge. A cleaving schism, its shape a partial crucifix, a new resurrection. Light's plane waxes, wanes, viral loads expands, contracts, photons spill, conduction sparks, light slow removes cataracts veil. In this blackness, lives matter.
Before you get into another poem, let's talk about the the format of the book. You said it's multi-genre. Why? There is poetry, there is prose, there is photographs. So how did you? I mean, why did you want to do this in this way?
As I said before, that the book actually happened rather than me constructing the whole book. It was a gift of the gods, really. The gods that didn't save my 12 friends saved me with poetry, in a sense. So I'm indebted to that god, but I'm not indebted to that god because it also killed so many people around me. I have a little introduction. It's a quote from one of the filmmakers. An artist's responsibility is to not to look away.
Not to look away.
And how can you not if you're a sensitive human being? So part of it was just recording a lot of things that were happening. Why is it multi-genre? Because I didn't think of it to make a book. So if I was inspired to write a poem, I did. I take photographs anyway. There were prose bits in the poem. There are little reportage which I was writing for newspapers, which were more like poetic pieces, which finally, when everything was put together, seemed like a cohesive whole. The photographs in the book, there's a chapter called Skyscapes, and for 2 months during the lockdown, I would go to the terrace and I selected one frame with the tree and the skyline, and I would shoot it in the morning, afternoon, and evening for 60 days. So 16 to 380 images I have. And when I saw those 180 images, I saw talking about nature ever changing, but nature healing. How beautiful my own city became. It was like as if I was in my childhood when it was actually much cleaner. So then I took just 12 of those pictures and they're in the book because I just thought that should be part of the book. Of course, they are color photographs, and immediately if I am being practical, and as poets you're not practical, if you put color photographs in the book, the publisher will eventually immediately say that the cost of the book printing is going to go up by manifold because it's a 4-color printing job as opposed to a single color printing job. I said, this is not a book I have been wanting to do because of any other commercial reasons. I had to put it together because my soul asked me to do it. And I'm not being very soul and particularly pious about the whole thing. It's something that happened, and I said, okay, what is the maximum that's going to happen? The publishers will keep saying no, 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 and no. That's fine, But they said yes, and they produced the book. It was an expensive to produce, and it's done really well. I mean, I'm really happy. It's in I think the 3rd edition in India. It's picked up the Rabindranath Tagore Prize few months ago, which was kind of a shock because it was competing against Mr. Ghosh's The Gun Island. I said, no chance. It had Anuradha Roy, it had a Booker Prize winning thing. And I said, 5 novelists, 1 poet, and there were a few non-fiction writers on the short list. So, and when it happened, I said, oh, this is fantastic. And it came with a good amount of money, which I've just donated back to charity because a charity I work for.
So that's why. So that's a thought that you thought you'll put prose. Can you talk about prose as well? I mean,
as Wisława Szymborska, the Nobel laureate, what did she say? Prose can never be poetry. Prose can aspire to be poetry, but poetry is always a poem.
Wow.
So I'm paraphrasing. It's not exactly what she said, but this is the gist of what she said. When you have poetic instincts, and I know you write poetry, which is why you allowed your daughter to be a cricketer, a woman cricketer. Not an easy decision for a man in this country to let go. So you must be a poet at heart because you are thinking that she will create these beautiful pie charts of 4s and 6s and beautiful lofted, square drives. And that, when you take a screenshot of that image, is going to be a poem done by your daughter. So to be a poet, you have to be a slightly deranged person. You have to be... It's a mental disease I don't want to be cured of. You can give me all the medication you want, I'll take it, but I do not want to be cured of the disease called poetry. Prose is easy in a way. So for a lot of my friends are novelists. Many of them, primarily most of them, my friends are novelists. So I see the way they work. They get up in the morning, especially the ones who are very dedicated. You know, it's like a day job. They get up in the morning, make their coffee or tea, and then sit through the whole day, and then log off in the evening. That's why they produce a book every year or every 2 years. And that is my model, because I also feel for any art, for poetry too, that is supposed to be the way. So I sort of give 2 hours every day to poetry. I do a lot of prose for journalism, for every other kind of writing I do is prose. So why pursue it when I'm doing it anyway to support poetry, so to speak?
Yeah, so before I ask you to read some more poem, let's talk about sound and silence. We often, connect or relate poetry to sound, or reading it out, or some sort of cadence to it.
Yeah.
But what about the silence in a poem? I mean,
It's a very good question, because if you look at my books, it's very, very carefully landscaped, or in this case called typeset, but mostly there's a lot of thought that goes into designing. The reason I say that is on the page, the white part of the page is the silence. So the white part of the page is equally, or if not more important than the inked part of the page. We think the other way around, because the sort of dialogic that is created between the words and the non-words is what creates the sort of tension of the narrative or the story or whatever you're saying on the page. So silence is incredibly important. You know, what is silence? Silence is also non-silence. Silence is a meditative state where we erase the sound around us and we do not hear it. It's not silence for everybody. The insect on the tree or the bird on the tree can hear other noises because they are operating on a different frequency. Which is what I was telling you earlier, that we as human beings have become so selfish and so I-oriented that we only think of ourselves and relate it to the cosmos. The larger cosmos is operating on a different scale of silence. And The Sounds of Silence, of course, is the great album by Simon and Garfunkel, and that is the sounds of silence, Hello darkness, my old friend.
yeah.
So silence is extremely important, because how do you balance sound and cadence? It's only working with silence that you could create that. In poetry particularly, you have things like breath pauses, you have line breaks, you have the ascenders and descenders, you have the whole system of metrics or prosody, so the iambics and the dactyls and so on, the whole scale and notation of sound pattern in poetry, which again gets reflected very well when you're seeing that same thing in dance. So I'll read the poem, not necessarily from Fractals, just because I was been talking so much about this dance thing. There was a situation, and this was, I think, in Trivandrum or Chennai, I forget where I saw this performance. So I'm not going to name the dancer because she's extremely well known. She's one of the divas of Indian classical dance. And so I went to this Bharatanatyam performance, and I was a young person, maybe in my early 20s or late teens or early 20s, and I watched her on the stage, and I was completely floored. Immediately fallen in love with this gorgeous person on the stage. And that happens very often for poets, by the way. We fall in love all the time, and our heart breaks all the time. And just over time, we just know how to deal with the heartbreak because, it's part of life. Then I wrote something, and then I got to know this lady a little bit. So another time she was going to have a performance, I asked her, can I possibly, because of my interest in photography, can I be the lights person? See, normally when you watch a performance, you watch it the way you're watching us. So the stage, the proscenium stage, has got the x-axis and the y-axis, which is the length and breadth of the stage, the height of the stage, and the z-axis would be the depth of the stage, right? What if you were the bird sitting on top of this tree, since it's under the tree? You would be viewing this whole thing from a different angle, hearing it very differently because the sounds are rising as opposed to coming to you. The entire geometry of sonography changes. Audiology changes. So when she was doing her practice rehearsal session, the auditorium was empty. I was on the top, the light grids where the light boys are, you know, and I took photographs of her rehearsing for 3 days in a row. This is pre-digital age, so gives our age away. All analog photographs. And when I looked at all the photographs, black and white, when I was processing it in the dark room, in the negative stage, I realized all the patterning she was making on the page. It was a beautiful grid she was making from the top, something you can't see at all when you're watching from this side. And then when I was watching her on the actual night, she was dancing particularly one item to ta dhin ta tai thai ta, ta dhin ta tai thai ta, ta dhin ta tai thai ta. And I was looking at the poem, and I said, part of it was reflecting that sound pattern. So I said, why cannot I invent a new rhyme scheme? ABACCA, ABACCA, that reflects the whole tal and the bol pattern. Now, of course, it's in the English language books of prosody that there's an Indian poet who has discovered this new thing. Since then, I've invented 2 other forms. So with I'm talking about sounds and silences. Back to all that. So it's a amazing space that you can do, because the geometrical and architectural pattern a poem has on the page is also very, very important. Why do you think the lines are indented in this particular way? Why do you think some poems are scattered? Why is it that some poems are in quatrains and not in couplets? There's a good reason for all that. Unfortunately, a lot of name to modern poetry happens because you can write a sentence these days, chop it up into 5 parts, arrange it in a column, and give a command, okay, Helvetica or Garamond, and print it on a laser printer. And most amateur poets would center it, and it prints out, and it looks pretty good. You think that you've written a good poem. It's a finished poem. That's the death knell of poetry, because it takes a long time. So there's a reason, behind
that's what
all
I
this.
Ask Sudeep. See, when you say poetry, you just said that's death knell of poetry. But who decides these rules? I don't want you to go back to the classic and say this is it. But then that's what I ask. How do you define poetry? Is it all rules?
It's not all rules. You need to know the rules to write good poetry.
What rules?
Grammar.
Grammar, this linguistic.
Linguistics, yeah,
It-
simple.
it
like if
applies
you,
to a
like you,
prosody as well.
it applies to prose as well. It applies to conversation like we are having
Yeah,
today.
yeah.
If we didn't have our grammar right, and
Yeah.
the gerund was dangling all over the place, and the
Yeah.
modifiers are not linked, we wouldn't make sense
Yeah,
at
it's
all.
true, yeah.
It'll be
Yeah,
gibberish.
right.
So the same thing. I'm not saying a modern poet has to write sonnets to impress someone. But we better know what it's like writing it to break the tradition.
Yeah.
So I tell my students, okay, today you write a sonnet, and they'll say, oh, sir, but that was, it's not relevant right now. We just have to get on the stage and go, yo, man, like love school, yeah, and the drum beat and all that. I said, but think of what you're imitating. You're imitating a certain kind of black African poetry which has rhythm, roots in very, very gospel singing, which are rhymed poetry. So if you don't know the essential grammar, what are you even breaking? Igor Stravinsky's famous piece, The Rites of Spring, when it came out in the classical world, people thought it was complete cacophony. But actually he's a classical musician. Actually what he was doing was talking about the situation of the post-industrial age, and his piece was a reflection of the chaos that was around. So he created this disjointed atonal piece of music. Now when you hear it, there's a whole rhythm pattern in it because he's playing against the formal thing. So that's that. See, good poetry is not about taste. Good poetry is about 2 things. A, not every poem you read by everybody you like. But what if I say read a poem, I hate the politics of the poem, I dislike the subject matter, but still feel that it's well done? I would say it's a good poem. The other way around doesn't work. If it's just bleeding heart and it's sloppy, and If it's sloppy on the page, it's sloppy on the page. It shouldn't be printed. I mean, it's just simple as that, you know. That's what we need to recognize. If you're doing a certain kind of oral poetry for cabaret or stand-up, that's a separate thing altogether. That's meant for the audience. Then the poem needs to work for that audience for that half a minute or 2 minutes, and it better work in that oral way. That also has its own rules, by the way.
So, but then I can't but ask this question, because we read a lot of Facebook poetry. You know, I don't want to get into a controversy, but then how do you look at
get into some controversy. Why not?
No, how do you look at this Facebook? Everyone is writing poetry on their Facebook. It's their Facebook. They can write and publish. So how do you look at it? And you're talking about rules and, you know, some grammar, some, you know, the seriousness of poetry. So they're also writing. They're also venting out something. So how do you look at them? And how
You've just answered your question. They are venting. They're just venting. So I see some poetry that happens. Someone's had a fight with their girlfriend and they've written 5 lines and it's on Facebook at night. In the morning, there are 5 likes. Okay. The person is still very frazzled because only 5 likes, people, I'm that lonely. So there's another discussion. 6th like comes from a friend who's feeling bad for him or her. 7th like comes from Uzbekistan. The person is so deluded, 3 days later they are internationally acclaimed poetry. You know, poets. 1 Uzbeki like, 6 likes local. You know, there's no filter system. I'm not against it. I'm just saying any sensible person would know venting versus real. You've just said it. Cathartic writing is fine. It's completely legit. But do you want to just force it onto people who are, you know, wake up in the morning and I don't want to read a badly sung rag. It's a Besura tune in the morning. I won't digest my coffee properly. I mean, imagine a morning rag not sung well. Would you stand for it? No. Same thing applies to writing or poetry. You know, good and bad you can judge very easily. It doesn't need an academic or a practitioner to say this is good or bad. It's very evident when it's working or when it's not working. It's also very evident when it rises above mediocrity. And of course, it's absolutely evident when it's brilliant.
You're also an editor, you know, Sudeep.
Yeah.
When you edit a collection, you make a lot of enemies, right? So let me, the other
Thank
other
you.
part of the
Thank you
question.
very much. Yeah.
The other part of the question is,
Some of them I'm in panels with later on in the day.
that's what I can do as a curator.
Yes.
Yeah?
You've put
We
me
do
with all my
guys.
enemies. Thank you.
Yeah. So, you know, when that editing process, how do you pick a poem? And how do you come to, I mean, years and years of reading and experience, of course. But other than that, is, you know, how, as an editor, how do you pick a poem? And I want this to be in that collection. Okay.
So if it's a non-thematic collection, and all the books I've done, except for a couple of online journals where I was asked to say curate a selection of Indian poetry on food, then you're looking for a theme. But mostly all the books I've done so far is non-thematic. It's to do with the best Indian poetry. So my area of specialty is Indian English poetry. That's from India and the diasporic Indian community. So to me, is to present the best of what's happening. 2 things happen. Usually I tell the publishing house to give me an editorial assistant, always, because there's no way of fielding so much stuff. What the editorial assistant does for you, this is my own mad way of doing it, everybody has a different way, is he or she will log everything on the computer and give each poem a title, a numeric thing.
Know the name.
No name. All the names are taken out. We, in fact, we print everything in the same font, in the same style, so that even visually I don't know whether, because I know some of the poets write in a particular way. I want to erase everything. It's a lot of work even before you start reading the 15,000 pages of poetry. So we completely erase all the thing, and I just, when I'm reading the poem, I'm just reading the piece of text. If it's working, it's working. So there are 3 piles: great, medium, trash. Trash becomes this big. It's easy. It's very easy. If your experience is very easy. The great is also easy because this poem leaps out and said, my God, why didn't I write like that? It's the medium pile which is the bulk of the book, which is very, very difficult. Even the same thing with judging processes when I'm on the jury of prizes. So once that happens, it self-selects itself. I have no political agenda. I don't know whether the person is brown, black, lesbian, not lesbian, bifocal, long distance problems, gender neutral pronoun. So much of other stuff comes in. All I'm interested in is a text, a poem which is well written. Then I just get them all together, and then final sifting happens on two counts. A, the publisher gives you, it can't exceed 200 pages or 400 pages, so only so many can get in. And, so it's purely on text. Only exceptions I make now, if it's a canonical book, like I've just done a big book which is available here, Converse, hopefully we'll have a session. He's struggling to find time for another poetry session because all the celebs are breathing down his neck, but a big important book called Converse, which celebrates 75 years of Indian poetry, has just come out in England and is distributed by Penguin India here, so the book is at an Indian price as well. There are at least 7 of the Converse poets in this ground floating around who can do this thing for you. In that case, there are some senior poets, very senior poets who are not computer literate, whose work I would want in the book in any case. I reach out to them. So that's not being unfair or fair, that's because they're just stature-wise so big, they've proven themselves. So, for instance, the oldest poet in the book is Jayanta Mahapatra. He's 98 right now, still living in a small village in Cuttack. His house, his address is wonderful. If you send him a book or a poem, Jayan Mahapatra, Teen Konia Bagicha, Cuttack, Orissa, it'll reach. It's one of those days, where you didn't have the names. Still publishing a journal. So, obviously him I would, ask for. But other than that, it's blind reading. And of course people who are your enemies, generally speaking, are the mediocre poets, the wannabes. They know where they stand. The really good poets don't really bother. They'll still be pals of yours. The really bad ones are also very easy because they also be pals. It's the mediocre wannabes, and there's too many of them lurking around everywhere, is a problem area.
Okay. I think we got just a few minutes left. How can I let you go without asking to read a poem to sum up the session?
So I'll read just 2 poems because I think it'll give 2 sides of this particular book. Is that okay? This one is called Language because we're talking so much about language, and it's got a particular, it's written in couplets. Couplets is a very favorite form of mine because it's also it's in tune with classical using music, the Upanishads, and all the texts have been written in couplets, most of them certainly. So this is called Language, and part of it is, of course, about politics of language, how language is twisted, cancel culture, Facebook posts, badly written grammar in the internet, emojis, bad emojis replacing phrases. But beyond, and even spinning language to a point that you can, be in Russia and swing the elections in America. That's also language. So it's about politics and language, but on a personal level, this is an ode and a homage to my first typewriter. It's still there on my desk. It's an old, clunky typewriter. It's well oiled. But the irony is that to source the black and silk ribbon is more difficult than to operate the type, more expensive also to operate it. Language. It has a little epigraph from Italo Calvino, and I quote, "Without translation, I would be limited to the borders of my own country. The translator is my most important ally." My typewriter is multilingual. Its keys mysteriously calibrating my bipolar, forked tongue. Black, red, silk ribbons, spools unwind as the carriage moves right to left. In cursive hand, I write from left to right. My tongue was born promiscuous, speaking in many languages. My heart spoke another, my head yet another, the translation seamless. Oracles, ventricles pump blood. Corpuscle like alphabets, phrases, syntax cross fertilize my text, breathing life. Texture enriched, music, cadence spatially enhanced, osmotic, polyglottal, a polygamy of grammar. Letter forms dance, ligatures pirouette, ascenders, descenders, pitch perfect. Imagination isn't caged in speech. Speech cannot be caged in language. And I want to end the session, and thank you for being so patient, with the last poem in the book. It's called Om, a Ceremony. Om is the first sound of civilization. Om Mani Padme Hum. Om is the sound of the womb. Om is everything. It also has some italicized lines within the poem from this wonderful poet called Agha Shahid Ali. He's a Kashmiri Indian poet. Many of you who haven't read him should. I urge you to go and read his work. But I won't say which lines because it spoils the rhythm of reading. The context is during the second wave, when all the people were dying and there was no space for burial grounds in Delhi. My city was being dug up. The central part of my city was being dug up to make these palaces of illusion. The Rajpath. Yeah. It has a little epigraph from Goethe in first line. Om, a ceremony, an architecture of frozen music. Goethe. In my city, I'm surrounded by constant cries of the dying, burning pyres heaving under burden of smoke, wood, and bones, wailing summed up by sonic notes of Om. Civilization's first sound, Sanskrit syllable echoing a conch shell's harmonic mapping. Its involute spiral geometry holding within and emanating airborne sonar screams. My ancestors, grandmothers, mother, blew into the smooth shell cupped in their palms, held intimately as if it were a talisman, a pranayam, a prayer. But breathing is such a privilege these days. Pandemic struck, oxygen deprived, my friends perish, the country buckles airless. Even an exquisite ceremony lacks the sheen or wax to wrap the contours of a corpse now. Each day as I write endless condolence notes, etching dirge-like couplets on gravestones, my city continues to be dug up, not to make space for burial sites, but for palaces of illusion. An architecture of frozen music, greed, calumny. A country without a government, a country without a post office, Shahid laments. Let me cry out in that void, say it as I can, I write on that void. Om, celebration now, an unceasing requiem. Yet we chant in hope for peace. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.